Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I should have known better than to return to that campsite. For 3 summers now, my family had experienced inexplicable events at this particular spot on Mount Rainier, nestled in the dense forest near the Nisqually River. Yet here we were again, my father with his ancient deaf shepherd mix, my brother and his wife, their 4-year-old daughter, and my sister-in-law's younger sister, all piling out of 2 vehicles loaded with camping gear. The air smelled wrong from the moment we arrived. Not bad, exactly, but heavy with something I couldn't name. The late afternoon sun filtered through the towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks, creating long shadows that seemed to stretch toward us rather than away. My father, a man not given to superstition, paused as he stepped out of his truck and surveyed the clearing with narrowed eyes. "Something's different," he muttered, though he didn't elaborate. We began unloading, the familiar rhythm of setting up camp temporarily pushing aside my unease. The dog, old and completely deaf, stayed close to my father's heels, which was unusual. Normally, despite her age and disability, she loved exploring new areas. Today, she pressed against my father's legs, trembling slightly. It was my niece who noticed the carving first. "Uncle, what's that on the tree?" I walked over to where she pointed, about 15 feet from where I planned to pitch my tent. Someone had carved words deep into the bark of an ancient cedar. "In loving memory of Gerald and Dorothy Hayes, together forever." The letters were weathered but still legible, and beneath the inscription 2 dates marked their deaths. The same date in September 1998. "We've camped here 3 times, my brother said, coming to stand beside me. "How did we never see this before?" I ran my fingers over the carved letters, feeling the rough grooves. The tree was massive, easily 10 feet in circumference, and the carving was at eye level. It should have been impossible to miss, yet none of us had any memory of it from our previous visits. By the time we finished setting up camp, the sun had disappeared behind the mountain peaks, and the temperature dropped sharply. I'd chosen to sleep alone in my small tent, positioned slightly apart from the others. My father's larger tent housed him and his dog. My brother's family had their own tent, and my sister-in-law's sister had set up a modest 2-person tent near the fire pit. Dinner was a quiet affair. Even my niece, usually chattering about everything, seemed subdued. She kept glancing over her shoulder at the tree line, where the darkness gathered thick and absolute. We had our camping lanterns and a fire, but the light seemed to push back against something oppressive, creating a small bubble of illumination that felt increasingly fragile. "You remember what happened last time?" my brother asked quietly while his wife took their daughter to brush her teeth. How could I forget? We'd all witnessed those lights. Not planes, not satellites, not drones. Blue points of light moving in patterns that defied physics, stopping instantly, reversing direction, forming geometric shapes before vanishing. And the next morning, all of us had woken feeling sick, our memories of the night fragmentary and disturbing. My father had found his watch stopped at 2:47 a.m., though it was a solar-powered model that never lost time. "Maybe it won't happen again," I said without conviction. "The dog knows," my father interjected. He was staring into the fire, his weathered hands clasped together. "She's been anxious since we got here. Dogs sense things." As if on cue, the old shepherd mix whined, a sound we could only hear because we were looking at her. Her cloudy eyes were fixed on something beyond our circle of light, her body rigid with tension. By 11 p.m., everyone had retired to their tents. I lay in my sleeping bag, fully clothed, listening to the sounds of the forest. The river rushed in the distance, a constant white noise. Occasionally, I heard the snap of a branch or the rustle of needles in the breeze. Normal sounds, safe sounds. I checked my watch. 11:47 p.m. I closed my eyes, knowing I wouldn't be able to relax until exhaustion claimed me. I jolted awake at 12:14 a.m., my heart hammering. Something had pulled me from the edge of sleep, some sound registering in my subconscious before my conscious mind could process it. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear beyond the tent fabric and my own pulse thundering in my ears. Then it came again, singing. A male voice, distant but clear, carrying through the night air with unnatural clarity. The melody was old-fashioned, something that might have been popular decades ago, though I couldn't place it exactly. The voice was pleasant, almost cheerful, completely at odds with the terror that began crawling up my spine. The singing was getting closer. I fumbled for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. Instead, I reached for my hunting knife, a 6-inch fixed blade I always brought camping. The handle felt cold in my palm as I gripped it, bringing it close to my chest. My sleeping bag suddenly felt like a trap, confining my movements, so I slowly unzipped it, trying not to make any sound. The singing continued, growing louder, closer. The man was approaching our campsite, and there was something wrong with how he moved. His voice didn't change in volume the way it should, as he navigated the uneven terrain. It was as if he were gliding, maintaining a constant distance from the ground. My tent was positioned near the carved tree, isolated from the others by about 20 feet. As the singing grew louder, I realized with mounting horror that I was between the singer and my family. Every muscle in my body tensed, my grip on the knife tightening until my knuckles ached. Then the singing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was complete, absolute. Even the river seemed to have gone quiet. I couldn't hear wind, couldn't hear insects, couldn't hear the normal breathing of the forest at night. It was as if someone had thrown a switch and turned off every natural sound. "Did you see where they went?" A man's voice, calm and conversational, came from somewhere near the carved tree. "No." A woman's voice answered from the opposite direction, closer to the cliff edge overlooking the river. "They have to be here somewhere." My mouth went dry. They were talking about us, about my family. I wanted to shout, to wake everyone, but some instinct kept me frozen and silent. This wasn't a situation where confrontation would help. These weren't lost hikers seeking assistance. I heard footsteps then, moving with purpose. The man walked between my tent and the carved tree. I could hear his feet crushing the pine needles, hear the slight scuff of his shoes against exposed roots. He was less than 3 feet away, separated from me by only the thin nylon of my tent wall. The woman moved in the opposite direction, her footsteps lighter but equally deliberate. They were circling the campsite, and I realized they were looking for something, or someone. The pattern of their movement was methodical, almost military in precision. "Check near the water," the man said. His voice was maddeningly normal, like someone discussing weekend plans. "Already did," the woman replied. She sounded younger, maybe in her 30s. "Nothing there but equipment." They met somewhere near the fire pit, their voices conferring in tones too low for me to make out words. I pressed my ear against the tent floor, trying to hear, trying to understand what was happening. The knife in my hand felt inadequate, a child's defense against something I couldn't comprehend. What terrified me most was the complete lack of light. They were moving through our campsite in total darkness, navigating around tents, trees, and the dangerous cliff edge without flashlights or lanterns. The moon was only a thin crescent, providing almost no illumination. A normal person would have tripped, stumbled, or at least moved cautiously. These people walked with confidence, as if they could see perfectly in the dark, or as if they knew this ground intimately. Minutes passed. 5, 10, 15. The footsteps continued their pattern, circling, searching, occasionally pausing. Once the woman walked so close to my tent that I could hear her breathing, slow, measured, patient. I held my own breath until my lungs burned, terrified that the slightest sound would alert her to my presence. Then, without warning, the sound stopped. Not gradually, not with the receding footsteps of people walking away, but instantly. One moment I could hear them moving around the camp, and the next, complete silence. I waited, knife still clutched to my chest, my entire body rigid with tension. The silence stretched on. 5 minutes, 10, 20. My arms began to ache from holding the same position, but I didn't dare move. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the normal sounds of the forest began to return. The river's rush, a slight breeze through the trees, a distant owl. I must have finally fallen asleep near dawn because sunlight filtering through the tent woke me. The knife was still in my hand, my fingers stiff from gripping it all night. I sat up slowly, my body aching from tension and adrenaline. For a moment, I wondered if I'd dreamed the entire experience, but the physical exhaustion and the knife in my hand confirmed it had been real. I crawled out of my tent to find my father already awake, feeding his dog. He looked as tired as I felt, dark circles under his eyes. The dog was still acting strangely, refusing to move more than a few feet from my father's side. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked carefully, not wanting to plant suggestions. My father poured dog food into a bowl, his movements slow and deliberate. "Voices," he said finally. "A man and a woman talking. Couldn't make out words, but they sounded close. Too close." The relief I felt at his confirmation was immediately overwhelmed by renewed fear. It hadn't been a dream. Whatever had happened, my father had experienced it too. My sister-in-law's sister emerged from her tent looking pale and shaken. She'd always been the most level-headed of us, a nurse who dealt with emergencies calmly. But now her hands trembled as she accepted a cup of coffee from my brother's wife. "Someone shook my tent last night," she said without preamble. "Hard, like they were trying to wake me up or get inside." I yelled, "What do you want?" But nobody answered. The shaking just stopped. My brother's family had been awakened by our voices and gathered around. His daughter stayed close to her mother, unusually quiet. "What time?" my brother asked. "I don't know exactly. Maybe midnight. A little after?" I pulled out my phone and checked the time I'd first heard the singing. 12:14 a.m. "That's when it started for me too," I said, and began describing everything I'd heard. My father nodded along, confirming the voices. His sister-in-law's experience fit the timeline. The tent shaking had probably happened while the man and woman were searching the campsite. "We're leaving," my brother announced. "Pack up, we're going." But my father shook his head. "We came for 3 nights. One strange night isn't enough to chase us off." "Dad," my brother started. "We don't run," my father interrupted firmly. He'd served in the military decades ago and still carried that steel in his voice. "We're careful, we stay alert, but we don't run." The debate was settled by distraction. My niece had been asking about a hiking trail marked on our map, and my brother's wife suggested we scout the area for alternative campsites, just in case we decided to move. We left my father at camp with his dog and set out as a group, following a rough path that led deeper into the forest. About a mile from our site, we found something that made us all stop short: an abandoned camp. It was completely intact, and clearly expensive. A large, high-quality tent, the kind that costs $300 or $400, stood fully erected. The entrance flap was partially open, revealing 2 queen-sized air mattresses still inflated, sleeping bags, pillows, and various camping equipment scattered around. Outside the tent, a cooler lay on its side, its contents long since spoiled. Children's items were everywhere: diapers, a small folding chair, toys, a baby carrier. "Look at this," my brother called. He was examining a notice zip-tied to one of the tent poles. The official park ranger document stated that the camp had been unattended for more than 14 days and would be removed if not claimed within the next 7 days. The date on the notice was from 2 weeks ago. Who leaves this much stuff? My sister-in-law's sister wondered aloud. She was right to be puzzled. This wasn't someone leaving behind a cheap tent because it was too much hassle to pack. This represented hundreds of dollars of equipment, plus personal items like clothing and photographs that people don't abandon lightly. I walked around the camp's perimeter, noting details. A campfire ring showed signs of a hasty departure, partially burned logs, a pot with food remnants still inside it, as if someone had been cooking and suddenly left. Clothes hung from a line strung between trees, some of them small children's garments that fluttered in the breeze like ghost flags. "It's like they ran," I said quietly. "Like something scared them badly enough that they grabbed what they absolutely needed and ran." My brother's wife pulled their daughter closer. "What could scare someone enough to leave all this?" No one answered because we all knew. The same thing that had circled our camp last night, moving through the darkness without light, searching for something. That evening, against my better judgment, we stayed at our original campsite. My father's stubbornness had won out, though we all agreed to sleep in shifts, with at least one person awake at all times. As the sun set, we decided on a short walk along the river, safety in numbers, and we'd be back before full dark. The path ran parallel to the water, winding through stands of trees and open sections where the Nisqually River churned over rocks. I walked ahead of the group, using my walking stick to test the ground and push aside low-hanging branches. My brother and his family followed, with my father and his dog bringing up the rear. The dog, despite her age and deafness, was pulling hard on the leash, clearly wanting to return to camp. I reached a section where the path narrowed, trees closing in from both sides to create a tunnel-like passage. The river sounds were muffled here, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the creak of branches overhead. I'd gone perhaps 10 feet into this section when I heard it. A growl. Low, rumbling, coming from somewhere ahead and to my left. My entire body went rigid. Bears were present in this area, and the last thing you wanted was to surprise one, especially as darkness approached. I stopped moving and slowly shifted my walking stick to a defensive position, holding it like a spear. The growl came again, sustained and threatening. It didn't sound like any bear I'd heard before. The pitch was wrong, somehow. Too intelligent, too measured. "Everyone stop," I called back quietly. "Something's ahead." The growling continued, and I heard movement in the brush. Whatever it was large. Branches snapped, and I caught a glimpse of something dark shifting between the trees. The shape was wrong for a bear, too tall, too narrow. My mind tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but the shadows and my own fear made it impossible to be certain. "We need to go back," I said, louder this time. Slowly. "No one run." I backed up, keeping my eyes on the area where I'd heard the sound, making sure never to turn my back on it. The growling had stopped, but the silence was worse. I could feel eyes on me, could sense something watching, tracking our movement. We made it back to camp in record time, nobody speaking until we were in the circle of firelight. My father broke out the bear mace we'd brought, checking that all 4 canisters were accessible. "Nothing goes out alone from now on," he said. "Not even to use the latrine." Sleep was difficult that night. I lay in my tent, listening for any sounds that didn't belong, my knife once again in hand. The voices didn't return, but around 2 a.m., I heard something large moving through the forest near our camp. Heavy footsteps that stopped at the edge of our clearing and stayed there for nearly an hour before moving on. Morning broke clear and cold. Despite my exhaustion, or perhaps because of it, I felt compelled to investigate the area where I'd heard the growling. My father insisted on coming with me, armed with bear mace and his own knife. We left the others at camp with instructions to stay together. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening but still oppressive. We followed the river path to the narrow section where I'd stopped the previous evening. In the bright morning sun, I could see the area clearly. Trees, underbrush. The river about 30 feet to our right. Nothing remarkable. "What exactly are we looking for?" my father asked. "I don't know. Evidence. Something to explain what I heard." We pushed into the underbrush, moving carefully, our eyes scanning for any sign of disturbance. The ground was a mix of pine needles, dirt, and exposed rocks. Near the river's edge, there was a small stretch of sand, deposited by high water events. That's where we found them. The first print was a footprint, but unlike any human print I'd seen, it was barefoot. That much was clear, but the proportions were wrong. My boot left a print about 11 inches long and 4 inches wide at its broadest point. This print was at least 14 inches long and 7 inches wide. The toes were clearly defined, showing a foot structure that was human-like but oversized. "My God," my father breathed. He knelt beside the print, holding his own hand up for comparison. His hands were large, swollen from an autoimmune condition that had left his joints inflamed and his fingers thick. But even his hand looked small next to what we found a few feet away, a handprint pressed deep into the wet sand. The handprint had 5 fingers, each one thick and powerful looking. The palm was massive, and when I placed my own hand inside it, my fingers didn't even reach the base of the print's fingers. It looked like a human hand scaled up by 50% or more. The hand of someone who would have to stand at least 6.5 feet tall, possibly taller. "Could be a tall person," my father said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Some people have abnormally large hands and feet." "Walking barefoot by the river?" I countered. "Dad, you know what this ground is like. Sharp rocks everywhere. Small patches of sand like this are rare. What would someone be doing out here barefoot in the middle of the night?" He didn't answer. We both stared at the prints, our minds trying to rationalize what we were seeing. A tall person with a medical condition causing enlarged extremities, wandering the forest at night without shoes. It was possible, barely. But it didn't explain the growling. It didn't explain the voices at our camp. It didn't explain the abandoned campsite or the sense of being watched, hunted, evaluated. I took photos of the prints, using my own hand and foot for scale. We searched the area for more evidence, but found nothing else. Just those two prints, as if whatever had made them had materialized at that spot, placed its hand and foot down once, and vanished. We packed up camp that afternoon, a day earlier than planned. My father didn't argue this time. The dog had refused to eat that morning, and had spent the night whimpering, her cloudy eyes fixed on the carved tree. On the drive down the mountain, I kept thinking about the memorial. Gerald and Dorothy Hayes died together in 1998. How had they died? Where? Had it been at that campsite, in that clearing where we'd slept? I made a mental note to research it when I got home, though I suspected I wouldn't find answers. My sister, who hadn't come on the trip due to work, called me that evening. After I told her everything, there was a long silence on the line. "You know what I think," she said finally. "I think you met the Hayes couple. The voices, the searching, they're looking for something. Maybe each other. Maybe they don't even realize they're dead. And the thing by the river? The prince? That, I don't know. Maybe it's unrelated. Or maybe there are more things in those woods than we want to acknowledge. I've been back to Mount Rainier since, but never to that campsite. Other areas of the mountain are beautiful, less troubled. My family agrees without saying it explicitly that we've had enough strangeness from that particular spot. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those voices circling in the dark, the methodical searching, the singing that stopped too suddenly, the prints in the sand that suggested something far larger than any human had walked there, and the memorial carved into that tree, marking the deaths of two people whose presence we may have disturbed. Whatever is in those woods, it's still there, still searching, still singing in the darkness. And I have no desire to encounter it again. I was 16 years old when my life changed forever. At 5'2", with blonde hair that caught the sunlight just right, and blue eyes that my grandmother always said reminded her of summer skies, I thought I was invincible. That Tuesday afternoon in 2018 started like any other day off from school. The Louisiana heat was beginning to ease as autumn crept in, making it the perfect weather for a long hike with my two companions. Zanzibar and Thingamajig were more than just dogs to me. They were my best friends, my protectors, my everything. Zanzibar, a magnificent Catahoula pit bull mix, had these piercing amber eyes that seemed to see straight through to your soul. His coat was a beautiful merle pattern of grays and blues that shifted in the light. Thingamajig, my pit bull lab mix, was all muscle and heart, with a glossy black coat and the most expressive brown eyes I'd ever seen on an animal. Both dogs weighed close to 70 pounds each, and their presence always made me feel safe on our adventures. The hiking trail I chose that day was one I'd walked dozens of times before. It wound through dense Louisiana woodland, with towering pine trees and thick undergrowth that created a natural canopy overhead. Spanish moss hung like curtains from ancient oak branches, and the earthy smell of decomposing leaves mixed with the sweet scent of wild honeysuckle. It was my sanctuary, my escape from the pressures of teenage life and the suffocating expectations that seemed to follow me everywhere else. As we started down the familiar path, both dogs bounded ahead with their characteristic enthusiasm. Zanzibar had found a particularly interesting stick, and was showing it off to Thingamajig, who responded by trying to steal it in a playful game of tug-of-war. Their joy was infectious, and I found myself laughing at their antics as we ventured deeper into the woods. The trail stretched for miles through the forest, with various offshoots that led to different scenic spots. Some paths led to small clearings where wildflowers bloomed in spring. Others wound down to a muddy creek where the dogs loved to splash and drink. Today I had planned to take the longer route that would loop us around the entire preserve and bring us back to the parking area in about 2 hours. The first hour passed peacefully. I threw sticks for the dogs, took photos of interesting plants with my phone, and simply enjoyed the solitude. There were no other hikers visible on the trail, which wasn't unusual for a weekday afternoon. Most people were at work or school, leaving the wilderness to those of us lucky enough to have the day free. As we rounded a bend in the trail, the dogs suddenly stopped their playing and looked ahead with focused attention. Their ears perked up, and Zanzibar let out a low rumbling growl that I'd never heard from him before. The sound sent an unexpected shiver through me, though I couldn't understand why. I called them back to me, and they came immediately, but their alertness remained. That's when I saw him walking toward us from the opposite direction. At first glance, he appeared completely ordinary, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second thought. He was around 5'9" with medium brown hair that was slightly unkempt and hazel eyes that seemed to dart around rather than focus on any one thing. His gray t-shirt was faded and had small stains on the front, and his dark blue jeans were worn at the knees. Nothing about his appearance screamed danger, yet something in my gut twisted uncomfortably as he approached. The dogs positioned themselves between me and the stranger, which was unusual behavior for them. Normally they were friendly with everyone we encountered on the trails. Thingamajig's tail, which was usually wagging enthusiastically at the sight of a new person, hung low and still. Zanzibar's hackles weren't raised, but his entire body language spoke of wariness. The man's gait was odd. Not quite a normal walking pace, but not hurried either. There was something deliberate about his movement, as if he had been waiting for us to come around that particular bend. He smiled as he got closer, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Instead, those hazel eyes seemed to be cataloging details about me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Excuse me," he called out when he was still about 20 feet away. His voice was higher than I expected, with a slight nasal quality that grated on my nerves. "Do you happen to have a lighter I could borrow?" I instinctively took a small step backward, and both dogs moved with me, maintaining their protective formation. "No, sorry," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady and polite. "I don't smoke, so I don't carry one." He continued approaching until he was uncomfortably close. Close enough that I could smell the stale cigarettes on his clothes and something else underneath that I couldn't identify. His smile widened, revealing teeth that were slightly yellowed and crooked. "That's too bad," he said. And then his eyes began a slow, deliberate journey from my face down to my feet and back up again. The way he looked at me made my stomach turn. It wasn't just a casual glance or even the kind of checking out that teenage boys sometimes did. This was something else entirely. Predatory, calculating, possessive. I felt like prey being sized up by a hunter, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, taking another small step closer. My throat felt dry, but I managed to speak. "Kaya," I lied without hesitation. Something about this man made me absolutely certain that giving him my real name would be a mistake I'd regret. "Kaya," he repeated slowly, as if savoring the sound of it. "That's a pretty name for a pretty girl. How old are you, Kaya?" The question sent alarm bells ringing in my head. No normal adult asked a teenage stranger their age in the middle of the woods. But something about his demeanor suggested that lying might be more dangerous than telling the truth. 16, I answered, hating how small my voice sounded. His smile became even more unsettling. 16. Perfect age. The way he said it made my blood freeze in my veins. The stranger's attention then shifted to my dogs, who had remained vigilant throughout our exchange. Zanzibar was now standing rigid as a statue, his intelligent eyes never leaving the man's face. Thingamajig had moved slightly ahead of me, positioning himself directly between us and the stranger in a way that was both protective and threatening. "Nice dogs you have there," the man said, but his tone suggested anything but admiration. "They look like they could be a problem if someone wanted to spend time with you." The implication in his words hit me like a physical blow. My heart began pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Every nerve in my body was screaming danger, and I could see that my dogs sensed it too. Zanzibar's ears had flattened against his head, and a barely audible growl was rumbling in his chest. "What kind of dogs are they?" he asked, seemingly oblivious to their hostile body language. "Mixed breeds," I replied curtly, not wanting to give him any more information than necessary. I glanced around, suddenly aware of how isolated we were. The trail stretched empty in both directions, with thick forest pressing in on either side. The nearest parking area was over a mile away, and there was no telling when another hiker might come along. The man nodded thoughtfully. "They're protective of you. I can see that. But every dog has its weakness, doesn't it?" He reached into his back pocket, and I saw Zanzibar's muscles tense as if preparing to spring. Whatever he was reaching for, he seemed to think better of it, and withdrew his empty hand. "Well, it was nice meeting you, Kaya," he said. And the way he emphasized the fake name I'd given him made it clear he didn't believe it was real. "Maybe I'll see you around here again sometime." The threat in those words was unmistakable. I managed to nod and started to move past him on the trail, calling my dogs to follow. They obeyed reluctantly, constantly looking back over their shoulders as we walked away. Every step we took, I could feel his eyes on us, burning into my back like lasers. As soon as we were around the next bend, and temporarily out of his sight, I pulled out my phone to check for signal. 1 bar enough to maybe make a call if I climbed to higher ground, but not enough to reliably send a text. The smart thing would have been to turn around immediately and head back to the parking area, but that would mean passing him again. The thought of facing those calculating eyes and that predatory smile made my stomach lurch. Instead, I decided to continue on the trail, hoping to put as much distance as possible between us before eventually circling back via one of the longer routes. It was a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. For the next 20 minutes, we moved as quickly as we could while still staying on the trail. The dogs seemed to understand the urgency of our situation without me having to explain it. They stayed close to my sides instead of ranging ahead as they normally would, and their playful energy had been replaced by a vigilant alertness that broke my heart. The forest around us, which had always been a source of peace and comfort, now felt oppressive and threatening. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. Every shadow between the trees could be hiding a stalker. The Spanish moss that had always seemed beautiful now looked like grasping fingers reaching down from above. We had covered nearly 2 miles when I heard it, a voice calling through the trees behind us. It was distant but unmistakable, and it was calling the name I had foolishly given him, Kaya. Kaya. The sound of my fake name being shouted through the woods sent terror shooting through my entire body. He was following us. Worse, he was getting closer. The tone of his voice had changed from the false friendliness he'd displayed during our initial encounter. Now there was something desperate and hungry in the way he called out. I quickened my pace, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dogs immediately matched my speed, their tongues hanging out as they panted with exertion and stress. Behind us, the voice continued calling, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, as if he was searching different branches of the trail system. "Kaya, I know you're out there, pretty girl." The endearment delivered in that sing-song tone made bile rise in my throat. I could hear branches snapping and leaves rustling as he moved through the underbrush. Apparently no longer bothering to stay on the established trails, he was hunting us like animals, and the realization that we were his prey sent waves of panic through my system. The trail ahead forked into 3 different directions. One led toward the creek, one continued through the main loop, and the third was a maintenance road that I'd never explored. In desperation, I chose the maintenance road, hoping it might lead to civilization or at least provide better cell phone coverage. As we hurried down the rutted dirt path, Thingamajig suddenly stopped and looked back the way we'd come. His ears were pricked forward, and he let out a low whine that spoke of his own fear and confusion. Then I heard what he had detected, footsteps running through the forest, getting closer with each passing second. The maintenance road led to a dead end, a small clearing where Forest Service equipment was sometimes stored. There was nothing there but an old metal shed and a few rusted barrels surrounded by impenetrable woods on 3 sides. We were trapped. I spun around, desperately looking for another way out, but the only exit was the path we'd just come down. That's when I heard his voice again, much closer now, and filled with an excitement that made my stomach turn. "Found you." He emerged from the tree line, no longer bothering to maintain his facade of normalcy. His hair was disheveled from pushing through branches. His clothes were dirty, and there was a wild gleam in his hazel eyes that spoke of barely contained violence. In his right hand he held something that caught the filtered sunlight and threw it back in sharp gleams. A knife. A hunting knife with a blade at least 6 inches long. "Now, Kaya," he said, advancing slowly as if approaching a skittish animal. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. I prefer the easy way, but honestly I don't mind a little fight." Both of my dogs immediately positioned themselves between us, their hackles raised and teeth bared. Zanzibar's growl had escalated to a full snarl, and Thingamajig was making a sound I'd never heard from him before, a deep, threatening rumble that seemed to come from the very core of his being. "Oh, the doggies want to play too?" the man asked with mock surprise. "That's fine. I brought something for them as well." The casual way he talked about hurting my beloved companion sent rage flooding through my system, temporarily overriding the fear. "Don't you dare touch them," I screamed, my voice echoing off the trees around the clearing. He laughed, a sound that was somehow worse than everything else he'd done so far. It was the laugh of someone who genuinely enjoyed causing terror, who fed off the fear of others like a vampire feeds off blood. "You're going to come with me, little girl," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than his earlier shouting. "We're going to go somewhere quiet where we can get to know each other better. And if these dogs try to stop us, well, let's just say they won't be a problem for very long." The way he gripped the knife handle told me he wasn't bluffing. This wasn't someone making empty threats. This was a predator who had thought this through, who had planned for resistance, who had done this before. I looked around desperately for anything that could be used as a weapon. But there was nothing. The rusted barrels were too heavy to lift, and the shed was locked tight. My phone showed no signal at all in this isolated spot. "Please," I whispered, hating myself for begging but unable to stop the words from coming. "Please just let us go. I won't tell anyone I saw you." His smile widened. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm not worried about you telling anyone. Where we're going, that won't be a concern." What happened next unfolded in a series of snapshots that would replay in my nightmares for years to come. The man lunged forward with shocking speed, the knife aimed directly at my chest. Zanzibar reacted instantly, launching himself at the attacker with the fury of a wild animal protecting its pack. The two collided in midair with a sickening thud, and they crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs and fur. I heard the man curse viciously as Zanzibar's teeth found purchase on his arm. But the dog's attack had thrown off his aim. Instead of the killing blow he had intended, the knife scraped along my ribs and then plunged into my back as I tried to spin away from him. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It felt like liquid fire had been poured into my body, radiating outward from the point of impact. I screamed, a sound that came from somewhere deep in my soul, and stumbled forward, my hands reaching behind me to the source of the agony. Thingamajig had joined the fray, his powerful jaws clamping down on the man's leg. I could hear fabric tearing and the man's voice rising to a shriek of pain and fury. But somehow, in the chaos of the fight, I heard something that made my heart stop. Zanzibar yelped, not the angry snarl of battle, but a cry of pure pain that told me the knife had found him too. "No!" I screamed, trying to turn around despite the fire in my back. "God, please no!" The man had managed to drive the blade into my brave dog's side, and I could see blood, so much blood matting his beautiful fur. But Zanzibar didn't release his grip on the attacker's arm. If anything, his jaws clamped down harder, and I could hear the grinding of teeth against bone. Thingamajig was still attacking the man's legs, his loyalty absolute despite the danger. The man was trying to shake him off while simultaneously attempting to pull the knife free from Zanzibar's body for another strike. Adrenaline flooded my system, temporarily overriding the pain from my wound. I grabbed one of the smaller rusted items from near the shed, a metal rod about 2 feet long, and swung it with all the strength I possessed at the man's head. The impact sent shockwaves up my arms, and the man's eyes rolled back as he crumpled to the ground. The knife fell from his grip and skittered across the dirt clearing. Both dogs immediately backed away from his still form, Zanzibar leaving a trail of blood drops as he moved. For a moment the clearing was filled with nothing but the sound of heavy breathing, and my own sobbing. Then Thingamajig began licking frantically at Zanzibar's wound, whimpering with distress. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely function, but I knew we had to get out of there immediately. The man was unconscious but still breathing, and I had no idea how long he would stay down. The metal rod had left a gash on his temple that was bleeding freely, but he could wake up at any moment. "Come on, boys," I whispered through my tears, my voice barely audible. We have to go right now." Zanzibar tried to stand but stumbled, his legs unable to support his weight. The knife wound in his side was deep and bleeding heavily, soaking the ground beneath him. Thingamajig whined and nudged his friend, as if trying to encourage him to get up. With strength I didn't know I possessed, I managed to lift Zanzibar and drape him across my shoulders. He weighed nearly 70 pounds, and the additional pressure on my own stab wound sent waves of agony through my entire body. But the thought of leaving him there with that monster was absolutely unthinkable. The journey back to the parking area was a nightmare blur of pain, terror, and determination. Every step was agony, both from my own injury and from carrying Zanzibar's dead weight. Thingamajig stayed right beside us, constantly looking back over his shoulder as if expecting our attacker to come charging after us at any moment. Blood was running down my back and soaking into my shirt, making the fabric stick to my skin in a horrible, clammy way. I could feel myself getting weaker with each step, but I kept putting one foot in front of the other through sheer force of will. When we finally reached the parking area, my car looked like salvation itself. I managed to get the back door open and gently deposited Zanzibar on the seat, where he lay panting heavily but alert. His eyes were still bright and aware, which gave me hope that the wound, while serious, might not be fatal. As I drove toward the nearest veterinary clinic, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, I kept checking the rearview mirror for any sign of pursuit. The country roads seemed endless, and every car behind us made my heart race with fresh terror. The veterinary clinic was a blur of concerned faces, urgent whispers, and medical procedures that I was too traumatized to fully comprehend. They took Zanzibar immediately into surgery while someone called an ambulance for me. The emergency room doctor who treated my wound was gentle but direct. The knife had penetrated deep enough to require stitches, but had miraculously missed any vital organs. I would have a scar that would remind me of this day for the rest of my life, but I would live. More importantly, Zanzibar pulled through his surgery with flying colors. The veterinarian told me that the knife had missed his major organs as well, though he would need several weeks of recovery time. The fact that both of us had survived what could have been a fatal encounter felt like a miracle. The police took my statement while I was still in the hospital, but when they went to search the maintenance road clearing, they found no trace of our attacker. There was blood on the ground where he had fallen, and the metal rod I had used to strike him, but the man himself had vanished. The knife was missing as well. Detective Morrison, the officer assigned to my case, explained that this was not the first report they had received of a man matching this description approaching young women on hiking trails in the area. I was the fourth girl to report an encounter with him in the past 6 months, but I was the first one who had managed to escape. The other 3 girls had not been so fortunate. In the weeks that followed, as Zanzibar healed and I underwent counseling to deal with the trauma, I made the decision to dye my blonde hair black. I couldn't bear to look in the mirror and see the same hair color that had attracted that monster's attention. The change felt like shedding a skin, becoming someone new who was harder to hunt. The man was never caught. Despite an intensive search by local law enforcement and even the FBI, he seemed to have vanished completely. Detective Morrison believed he had either left the area or was lying low, waiting for the heat to die down before resuming his hunting. I never returned to that trail. In fact, I avoided hiking alone entirely for over a year. When I finally did start taking Zanzibar and Thingamajig on walks again, it was only in busy public parks with plenty of other people around. The wilderness that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a hunting ground where predators waited in the shadows. Even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night convinced I heard someone calling Kaya outside my window. The fake name I gave him has become a trigger word that sends instant panic through my system. But I survived. My dogs and I survived, and that has to count for something. Zanzibar bears a scar on his side that mirrors the one on my back, and sometimes I catch him staring out into the darkness with the same wary alertness he showed that day. Thingamajig has become even more protective of me, if that was possible, rarely leaving my side when we're outside. To anyone reading this who lives in southern Louisiana or anywhere else, please be careful. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong. Carry protection when you can. And remember that there are monsters walking among us who look perfectly ordinary until they reveal their true nature. That man is still out there, still hunting. I pray that God will protect his future victims, and that someday, somehow, he will face justice for what he's done. But until that day comes, I'll keep looking over my shoulder, and I'll never stop being grateful for 2 loyal dogs who were willing to die to protect me. The Kansas River moved like black oil through the darkness, its surface barely disturbed by the humid August breeze that carried the scent of dying fish and wet earth. My friends and I had been coming to this park in Shawnee for years, drawn by its isolation and the way the ancient cottonwoods created a natural cathedral along the water's edge, but tonight felt different. The fog rolled in thick and suffocating, transforming familiar landmarks into grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe and pulse in the dim moonlight. We had parked near the boat ramp as usual, our footsteps muffled by the damp grass as we made our way toward our favorite spot, a clearing where the trees formed a natural amphitheater. The fog clung to everything, reducing visibility to mere feet in any direction. Every breath felt heavy, laden with moisture that seemed to coat the inside of our lungs with each inhalation. "This is some horror movie shit," one of my friends muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The fog seemed to swallow sound, making even our quiet conversation feel intrusive in the oppressive silence. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another tree trunk, pale and slender against the darker bark of the cottonwoods. But then it moved, a subtle rhythmic swaying that made my stomach clench with inexplicable dread. The movement was hypnotic, pendulum-like, as if the thing was hanging upside down and letting gravity pull it back and forth. But it wasn't hanging, it was standing, perfectly balanced on legs that seemed too thin to support even its slight frame. The creature stood about 5 feet tall, its skin so pale it seemed to glow with its own sickly luminescence. In the dense fog it appeared translucent, almost spectral, as if it existed only partially in our world. Its limbs were elongated and unnaturally thin, giving it the appearance of something that had been stretched on a medieval rack. The torso was narrow, almost concave, with ribs that showed through the alabaster skin like the bars of a cage. But it was the eyes that froze the blood in my veins. 2 brilliant yellow orbs stared at us from a face that was almost human but wrong in every conceivable way. The eyes were too large, too bright, and they seemed to pulse with their own internal light. They reminded me of the eyes of deep-sea creatures, adapted for perpetual darkness, glowing with bioluminescent fury. The yellow was not the warm amber of autumn leaves, but the sick, jaundiced color of infection and decay. The face itself was a nightmare of sharp angles and hollow planes. The cheekbones jutted out like knife blades, casting deep shadows that made it impossible to determine if the creature had a nose, or just 2 black holes where one should be. The mouth, if it could be called that, was a thin, lipless slash that seemed to extend too far toward the ears, giving the impression of a permanent sardonic grin. My friends stood frozen beside me, their breathing shallow and rapid. The creature didn't seem to notice us at first, or if it did, it showed no sign of concern. It simply continued its rhythmic swaying, back and forth, like a metronome keeping time to some unholy symphony only it could hear. The fog swirled around it, and for a moment I lost sight of the thing entirely. When it cleared, the creature was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. My friends nodded, their faces pale and drawn. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at the empty space where the creature had been. The fog continued to roll across the park, and every shift in the mist made us jump, expecting to see those terrible yellow eyes materializing from the gloom. The park around us felt different now, charged with a malevolent energy that made the hair on our arms stand on end. The familiar sounds of the night, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of night birds, the gentle lapping of water against the shore, all seemed muted and distorted. It was as if the very air had become thick and viscous, pressing against us from all sides. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the car. Each step felt deliberate and careful, as if the ground itself might give way beneath us. The fog seemed to follow us, tendrils of mist reaching out like grasping fingers. I could feel eyes on us, not just the yellow orbs we had seen, but others, hidden in the darkness, watching our every move. As we reached the parking area, I turned back one last time. The fog had grown thicker, if that was possible, and the park had disappeared entirely into the white void. But just for a moment, I thought I saw movement in the mist, multiple shapes, pale and swaying, keeping time to that same unholy rhythm. The drive home was conducted in complete silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, trying to process what we had witnessed. The warm interior of the car felt like a sanctuary, but even there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. The familiar streets of Shawnee looked different somehow, as if we were seeing them through a lens that had been slightly distorted. That night, sleep eluded me entirely. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow orbs staring back at me, pulsing with their sickly light. I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on my windows and doors, though I couldn't say exactly what I was trying to keep out. The darkness outside seemed deeper than usual, filled with shapes that moved just beyond the edge of perception. When dawn finally broke, I felt no relief. The sunlight seemed wan and inadequate, unable to fully banish the shadows that had taken root in my mind. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that what we had seen in the park was not a one-time occurrence. The creatures were there, in the fog, in the darkness, waiting and watching, and somehow I knew we would see them again. 3 weeks passed before we returned to the park. 3 weeks of restless nights and lingering unease, of conversations that died abruptly when one of us mentioned what we had seen. We tried to rationalize it, to explain away the impossible sight that had seared itself into our memories. Maybe it was just a trick of the fog, a play of light and shadow that our frightened minds had transformed into something sinister. Maybe we had all succumbed to some form of group hysteria, feeding off each other's fear until we had conjured a monster from nothing. But deep down, we all knew better. The creature had been real. The memory of those yellow eyes remained as vivid and terrifying as the moment we had first seen them. And despite our fear, or perhaps because of it, we found ourselves drawn back to the park like moths to a flame. This time, we came prepared. Flashlights, cameras, even a digital recorder to capture any sounds the creatures might make. We told ourselves we were being scientific, methodical. We were going to document whatever we found and prove to ourselves and others that these things existed. But the truth was simpler and more disturbing. We were addicted to the fear, to the terrible thrill of standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. The fog was thicker tonight, if that was possible. It rolled off the Kansas River in dense, suffocating waves, transforming the park into an alien landscape where familiar landmarks became grotesque and threatening. Our flashlights seemed pathetically inadequate against the oppressive darkness, their beams absorbed by the mist after only a few feet. We made our way to the same clearing where we had seen the creature before, moving slowly and quietly, though the fog muffled our footsteps to the point where we could barely hear ourselves walking. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of our own breathing and the distant murmur of the river. That's when we heard it. A soft rustling in the trees above us, like the sound of leaves stirring in a non-existent breeze. But there was no wind tonight. The air was still and heavy, pregnant with moisture and something else. Something that made our skin crawl with primal dread. The rustling grew louder, more pronounced, and we realized it wasn't the sound of leaves at all. It was the sound of movement, of multiple forms shifting and swaying in the branches above our heads. The fog made it impossible to see clearly, but we could make out vague shapes among the cottonwoods, pale forms that seemed to blend with the mist itself. There, one of my friends whispered, pointing up into the canopy. "Do you see them?" I followed his gaze and felt my heart stop. They were everywhere. Dozens of them, maybe more, perched on branches like some unholy congregation. The pale, elongated forms swayed in unison, their movements creating a symphony of whispers and creaks that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Their eyes blazed like stars in the darkness, yellow and unblinking, focused on us with an intensity that made my skin feel like it was crawling with insects. They didn't move toward us, didn't make any aggressive gestures, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. The air itself seemed to thicken with their attention, pressing against us like a physical weight. One of them was closer than the others, perched on a low branch not 20 feet away. In the pale glow of our flashlights, I could see it more clearly than I had that first night, and the details made my stomach turn. Its skin was not merely pale, it was translucent, revealing the dark network of veins beneath like a roadmap of corruption. The limbs were jointed in ways that defied human anatomy, bending and flexing at angles that should have been impossible. The face was even more disturbing in the direct light. The yellow eyes were set deep in sockets that seemed too large for the skull, giving the impression of a creature that was all eyes and hunger. The nose was barely a suggestion, just two slits that flared and contracted with each breath. The mouth was a wound in the pale flesh, lipless and black, occasionally revealing what might have been teeth, or might have been something far worse. But it was their behavior that truly terrified me. They moved with a fluid grace that was utterly alien, their bodies flowing like liquid from one position to another. The swaying motion we had first observed was constant, hypnotic, as if they were all connected to some invisible conductor orchestrating their movements. And they were completely silent, no breathing, no sounds of movement, just the soft whisper of air displaced by their presence. We stood transfixed, unable to move or speak, as the creatures continued their vigil. They seemed to be studying us, cataloging our every movement and expression with those terrible yellow eyes. I had the disturbing sensation that they were not just looking at us but through us, seeing something in our souls that we ourselves were unaware of. The fog began to shift and swirl, and suddenly the creatures were in motion. They moved with impossible speed, flowing from branch to branch like liquid shadows. One moment they were there, the next they had vanished into the mist, only to reappear somewhere else entirely. The movement was so fast it seemed to defy physics, creating afterimages that lingered in our vision like burned retinas. One of them, the closest one, suddenly dropped from its perch, landing silently on the ground just outside our circle of flashlight beams. It stood there for a moment, perfectly still, its yellow eyes fixed on mine. Then it began to move toward us, not walking but gliding, its feet barely touching the ground. We broke and ran. The fog seemed to come alive as we fled, reaching out with tendrils of mist that grasped at our clothes and faces. Behind us I could hear the soft whisper of movement, the creatures following us through the darkness with their inhuman grace. They moved through the fog like ghosts, their forms appearing and disappearing in the mist, always just at the edge of vision. We reached the car and dove inside, slamming the doors and locking them with trembling hands. The engine turned over on the third try, and we sped away from the park as if the hounds of hell were at our heels. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of pale forms standing at the edge of the parking area, watching us disappear into the night. The drive home was a nightmare of paranoia and terror. Every shadow seemed to harbor those yellow eyes. Every movement in the fog might be one of the creatures keeping pace with our car. We drove in silence, but the fear was palpable, filling the vehicle like a toxic gas. When we finally reached safety, we sat in the car for a long time, unwilling to venture out into the darkness. The familiar streets of our neighborhood seemed like foreign territory now, potentially hostile ground where anything might be lurking in the shadows. That night I dreamed of yellow eyes and pale forms moving through endless fog. I woke several times, convinced I could see shapes outside my window, swaying in the darkness like living pendulums. The rational part of my mind tried to dismiss it as imagination, but the primal fear that had taken root in my soul knew better. The creatures were real, and they were watching us. Even now, even here, in the supposed safety of our homes, I could feel their presence pressing against the boundaries of our world, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves again. And deep down, I knew that moment was coming soon. The phone call came 3 days later, just as the sun was setting and the shadows began to grow long across my backyard. It was my friend's voice, tight with excitement and fear. "You need to come down to the farm off Highway 7, he said without preamble. "There's a farmer here who's been seeing them too. He wants to talk to us." The farm was a ramshackle affair, the kind of place that had been slowly dying for decades. The barn leaned at a precarious angle, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. The farmhouse itself was little better, with warped siding and windows that caught the dying light like dead eyes. But it was the farmer himself who truly disturbed me. He was ancient, his skin weathered and cracked like old leather, his eyes the pale blue of winter sky. When he spoke, his voice was a rasp that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest, as if the words had to fight their way past years of accumulated dust and sorrow. "Been seeing them for near on 30 years, he said, gesturing toward the tree line that bordered his property. "Started just after I bought this place. Thought I was going crazy at first, seeing things in the fog that couldn't be there." We sat on his porch as darkness fell, the old boards creaking under our weight. The fog was beginning to rise from the low places in his fields, and I could already feel that familiar prickle of dread along my spine. "What do they do?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The farmer's eyes took on a distant look, as if he was seeing something far beyond the present moment. "They watch," he said simply, "always watching. But it's gotten worse over the years. They're getting bolder, coming closer to the house." He pointed toward a copse of trees about 100 yards away. See that stand of oaks? That's where they like to gather. Sometimes there's just one or two, but on nights like this, when the fog's thick, there can be dozens of them. They stand among the trees, swaying back and forth, and those yellow eyes, God, those eyes. As if summoned by his words, the fog began to thicken around the oak trees. And there, barely visible in the growing darkness, I could see them, pale forms moving among the shadows, their eyes gleaming like malevolent stars. Even at this distance, the sight of them made my blood run cold. They move so fast, the farmer continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. Faster than anything has a right to move. I've seen one of them cross half a mile in what seemed like the blink of an eye. 1 second it was at the far end of the field, the next it was standing right at the edge of my porch. He paused, his ancient hands trembling slightly as he reached for a glass of water. That was 2 weeks ago. I haven't slept right since. Keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find one of them standing beside my bed, just watching. The creatures in the oak grove had multiplied as the fog thickened. There were at least a dozen of them now, their forms barely distinguishable from the mist itself. They moved with that same hypnotic swaying motion we had observed in the park. But there was something different about them here. They seemed more agitated, more purposeful. Have you ever tried to approach them? My friend asked. The farmer let out a bitter laugh. Once. About 10 years ago. I was younger then, still had some fight left in me. Took my shotgun and marched right out to those trees, determined to find out what they were. He fell silent for a long moment, staring at the gathering creatures with an expression of profound unease. They didn't run when they saw me coming, just stood there swaying, watching me with those terrible eyes. And when I got close enough to see them clearly, his voice trailed off, and I could see the fear in his eyes, as fresh and raw as if the encounter had happened yesterday. What did you see? I pressed. Their faces, he whispered. Up close you can see that they're not quite human. The proportions are all wrong, like someone tried to sculpt a person from memory but got the details mixed up. And their skin, it's not just pale, it's almost transparent. You can see things moving underneath, dark shapes that might be organs or might be something else entirely. The fog had grown so thick that the creatures were now completely obscured, but I could still feel their presence, pressing against the boundaries of perception like a weight on my chest. The air itself seemed to vibrate with their attention. But that's not the worst part, the farmer continued. The worst part is that they recognize you. Once you've seen them, really seen them, they know you. They start showing up in other places at the edge of your property, in the shadows of your barn, sometimes even closer to the house. As if to emphasize his point, a pale form suddenly materialized at the edge of the fog, no more than 50 feet from the porch. It stood perfectly still, its yellow eyes fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The creature was close enough that I could see the unnatural way its limbs were jointed, the way its chest rose and fell with breathing that seemed too slow, too deliberate. That's the one that comes closest, the farmer said, his voice barely audible. Been showing up every night for the past week. Just stands there watching the house. Sometimes I wake up and it's right outside my bedroom window, pressed against the glass like it's trying to get in. The creature began to move toward us, its gait fluid and unnatural. It didn't walk so much as flow, its feet barely touching the ground. With each step it seemed to grow more solid, more real, as if the fog itself was condensing into its pale form. We all stood up involuntarily, our chairs scraping against the wooden porch. The creature stopped about 20 feet away, just at the edge of the porch light's reach. In the pale glow, I could see its face clearly for the first time, and the sight made my stomach turn. The features were human-like but wrong in every conceivable way. The eyes were too large, too bright, set in sockets that seemed to have been carved from bone. The nose was just a suggestion, two slits that flared and contracted with each breath. The mouth was a lipless gash that stretched almost from ear to ear, revealing not teeth but something that looked like rows of tiny sharp needles. But it was the expression on that terrible face that truly frightened me. It wasn't malevolent or hungry. It was curious, almost childlike in its intensity. The creature was studying us with the same fascination that a child might show when examining insects under a magnifying glass. "What does it want?" I whispered. The farmer's laugh was hollow, bitter. "That's the question, isn't it? What does any of them want? They don't attack, don't make any aggressive moves. They just watch and wait, like they're studying us for some purpose we can't understand. The creature tilted its head to one side, the movement sharp and bird-like. Then, without warning, it was gone. Not fled, not hidden, simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. The fog swirled in the space where it had stood, and for a moment I could have sworn I saw other forms moving in the mist, dozens of them, all watching us with those terrible yellow eyes. "They're getting more active," the farmer said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Every year there are more of them, and they're getting braver, coming closer to civilization. Won't be long before other people start seeing them too." As if summoned by his words, the fog began to shift and swirl, and suddenly the creatures were everywhere. They emerged from the mist like ghosts materializing from the ether, their pale forms creating a semicircle around the farmhouse. There were dozens of them, maybe more, all swaying in unison, all watching us with those blazing yellow eyes. The air itself seemed to thicken with their presence, pressing against us like a physical weight. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, and my hands were slick with sweat despite the cool evening air. The creatures didn't move toward us, didn't make any threatening gestures, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. "We need to leave," my friend whispered, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own breathing. But as we turned to go, I caught sight of something that made my blood freeze. Among the pale forms surrounding the farmhouse, I saw one that was different from the others. It was larger, more substantial, and its eyes burned with a brighter, more intense light. And unlike the others, this one wasn't swaying. It stood perfectly still, its gaze fixed on me with an intelligence that was unmistakably malevolent. The creature opened its mouth, and for the first time I heard one of them make a sound. It was a whisper, barely audible, but it carried clearly through the fog-laden air. A single word spoken in a voice that was almost human but wrong in every conceivable way. "Soon." We ran then, abandoning the farmer to his vigil, fleeing into the night like children escaping from a nightmare. But as we drove away, I could see the creatures in the rearview mirror, standing at the edge of the farmer's property, watching us disappear into the darkness. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the encounter at the farm had changed something fundamental. The creatures were no longer content to simply watch from the shadows. They were preparing for something, gathering their strength for some unknowable purpose. And we were running out of time to figure out what that purpose was. The weeks following our encounter at the farm passed in a haze of sleepless nights and growing dread. The creatures had become more aggressive, more visible, appearing not just in the fog-shrouded park, but in other locations around Shawnee. My friends and I began to piece together reports from other witnesses. A jogger who had seen glowing yellow eyes in the trees along the river trail, a night shift worker who had spotted pale forms moving through the fog in the industrial district, a police officer who had investigated reports of strange lights only to find himself face to face with something that defied explanation. The pattern was always the same. The creatures appeared on foggy nights, always watching, always just beyond the edge of complete visibility. They moved with that impossible speed, flowing through the mist like liquid shadows, and their eyes blazed with that sickly yellow light that seemed to burn itself into the retinas of anyone who saw them. But it was their behavior that truly disturbed me. They were no longer content to simply observe from a distance. Each sighting brought them closer to populated areas, closer to the warm lights of homes and businesses. They were learning, adapting, growing bolder with each passing night. The farmer's words haunted me. "They're getting more active. Every year there are more of them." But I was beginning to suspect that it wasn't just a matter of numbers. The creatures were changing, evolving, becoming something more than the passive observers they had once been. The first sign of this transformation came on a particularly foggy Thursday night. I was driving home from work, the familiar route made treacherous by the thick mist that had rolled in from the river. Visibility was down to mere feet, and I had to creep along at a crawl, my headlights barely penetrating the suffocating blanket of fog. That's when I saw them. They were standing in the middle of the road, a line of pale forms stretching across both lanes. Their eyes blazed like headlights in the darkness, and they stood perfectly still, perfectly silent, as if they were waiting for something. I slammed on the brakes, my heart hammering in my chest, but the creatures didn't move. They simply stood there, watching me with those terrible yellow eyes. For a moment we stared at each other across the fog-shrouded asphalt. Then, as if responding to some invisible signal, they began to move. But instead of flowing away into the mist as they had done before, they moved toward the car, their forms becoming more solid, more substantial with each step. I threw the car into reverse, but it was too late. They were already surrounding the vehicle, pressing against the windows with their pale, translucent faces. Up close, I could see details that made my stomach turn. Their skin was not just pale, it was luminescent, glowing with its own internal light. The veins beneath the surface were clearly visible, pulsing with some dark fluid that might have been blood or might have been something far worse. Their eyes were the worst part. They were huge, far larger than any human eyes should be, and they seemed to see right through me, cataloging every thought, every fear, every memory. The yellow light that emanated from them was not steady but pulsing, like a heartbeat made of light. One of them pressed its face against the driver's side window and I could see its mouth clearly for the first time. It was not a mouth at all but a wound in the pale flesh, black and seemingly bottomless. As I watched in horror, it began to move, the edges rippling like water, and I realized it was trying to speak. No sound came out, but I could read the shape of the words on those terrible lips. "Come with us." I floored the accelerator, and the car shot backward through the fog. The creatures made no attempt to stop me, simply watching as I fled into the night. But as I drove away, I could see them in the rearview mirror, standing motionless in the road, their eyes burning like beacons in the darkness. The next morning I called my friends and told them what had happened. They listened in stunned silence, and I could hear the fear in their voices when they responded. Similar encounters were becoming more common. They said, the creatures were no longer content to lurk in the shadows. They were making contact, trying to communicate. But what they wanted to communicate was the question that kept us all awake at night. The answer came 2 days later, when the fog rolled in thicker than ever before. It was a Saturday night, and despite our growing fear, we found ourselves drawn once again to the park by the river. We told ourselves we were being foolish, that we should stay away from the places where the creatures gathered. But the truth was that we were addicted to the fear, to the terrible thrill of standing on the edge of something vast and unknowable. The fog was so thick that we could barely see our hands in front of our faces. The familiar landmarks of the park had disappeared entirely, replaced by a white void that seemed to stretch on forever. We moved slowly, carefully, our flashlights creating small pools of light in the endless darkness. That's when we heard them. It started as a whisper, so soft that we almost missed it. But gradually the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking in unison, creating a chorus of sound that seemed to come from the fog itself. We couldn't make out the words at first, but the tone was unmistakable. They were calling to us, summoning us, drawing us deeper into the mist. The voices were hauntingly beautiful, almost musical, and I found myself taking a step forward before I realized what I was doing. "Don't listen to them," my friend whispered, grabbing my arm. "Whatever they're saying, don't listen." But it was too late. The voices had already wormed their way into our minds, and we could feel them tugging at our thoughts, our memories, our very souls. They were speaking in a language that was almost human, but not quite, the words twisting and flowing like liquid music. As we stood there, transfixed by the sound, the fog began to part. A corridor of clear air opened before us, leading deeper into the park, deeper into the darkness. And there, at the far end of the corridor, we could see them. They were gathered in a vast circle, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Their pale forms seemed to glow in the darkness, and their eyes blazed like stars in a night sky. They stood perfectly still, perfectly silent, but I could feel their attention focused on us like a physical weight. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were coming from the creatures themselves. They were singing, their mouths moving in perfect synchronization, creating a harmony that was both beautiful and terrifying. The song seemed to bypass our ears entirely, speaking directly to some primal part of our brains that understood meaning without words. And suddenly, I knew what they were saying. They were telling us their history, their purpose, their plan. They had been here long before humans arrived, dwelling in the spaces between reality and dream, feeding on fear and fascination. They had watched as our ancestors built their settlements along the river, had observed as we grew and multiplied and spread across the land. But something had changed. The barriers between their world and ours had begun to weaken, allowing them to manifest more fully in our reality. They were no longer content to simply observe from the shadows. They wanted to cross over entirely, to walk among us, to claim this world as their own. And we, the witnesses, the ones who had seen them and acknowledged their existence, were to be their ambassadors, their guides into the world of the living. The revelation hit me like a physical blow, and I staggered backward, breaking the spell that had held us transfixed. The corridor of clear air began to collapse, the fog rushing back in to fill the void. But the creatures were already moving, flowing toward us with that impossible speed, their eyes blazing with triumph. We turned and ran, crashing through the fog-shrouded park like blind men fleeing from a fire. Behind us I could hear the chorus of voices growing louder, more jubilant, as if our flight was exactly what they had been waiting for. We reached the car and dove inside, our hands shaking as we started the engine. As we pulled away from the park, I caught one last glimpse of the creatures in the rearview mirror. They were standing at the edge of the parking area, no longer swaying, no longer passive. They stood like soldiers at attention, their eyes burning with purpose. The gathering storm was about to break, and we were caught in the eye of it. The creatures were preparing for something, marshaling their forces for some final push into our world. And we, the unwilling witnesses to their existence, were about to become players in a game whose rules we didn't understand. But one thing was clear. The time for passive observation was over. The creatures were coming, and they were bringing the fog with them. The fog came on the last night of October, rolling in from the Kansas River like a living thing. It was thicker than anything we had ever seen, a wall of white that swallowed the world whole. Streetlights disappeared into the mist. Buildings became vague shadows, and the familiar streets of Shawnee transformed into an alien landscape where nothing was as it should be. I was at home when it started, watching the news and trying to pretend that everything was normal. But the fog was visible from my living room window, creeping across the landscape like a slow-motion avalanche. The meteorologist on television was calling it an unusual atmospheric phenomenon, but I knew better. This wasn't weather. This was something else entirely. My phone rang and I answered it without checking the caller ID. My friend's voice was tight with fear. "They're everywhere," he whispered. "The whole town is covered in fog, and they're moving through it like they own it. You need to get out of your house now." I looked out my window and felt my blood turn to ice. The fog had reached my neighborhood, and I could see shapes moving within it, pale forms that glided through the mist with predatory grace. Their eyes blazed like yellow stars, and they were heading straight for the houses, straight for the warm lights where people huddled in their living rooms, oblivious to the danger approaching. "Where do we go?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The park," he said. "It's where this all started. If we're going to make a stand, it has to be there." I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, but I was already too late. The fog had surrounded my house, and I could see them through the windows, dozens of pale figures standing in my yard, their eyes fixed on the house with that terrible intensity. They didn't move, didn't make any aggressive gestures, but their presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I tried the back door, but they were there too, standing among the trees like sentinels. There was no escape, no way out except through them. Taking a deep breath, I opened the front door and stepped into the fog. The creatures parted before me like water, creating a corridor through their ranks. Up close, I could see that they had changed since our first encounter. They were more solid now, more present, as if the fog itself was giving them substance. Their skin still glowed with that pale luminescence, but it was brighter now, more vibrant. The veins beneath the surface pulsed with dark energy, and their eyes burned with an intensity that made it painful to look at them directly. One of them stepped forward. The large one I had seen at the farmer's house, the one that had spoken to us. It stood directly in front of me, blocking my path. And when it opened its mouth, its voice was clearer than before, almost human. "You understand now," it said, the words forming in the air like smoke. "You see what we are, what we have always been. The barriers are failing, and soon there will be no separation between your world and ours." I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything except stand there and listen to that terrible voice. But I found myself frozen, transfixed by the creature's gaze. Its eyes were not just yellow, they were golden, like molten metal, and they seemed to see right through me to the very core of my being. "Why us?" I managed to whisper. "Why are you telling us this?" The creature's mouth curved in what might have been a smile, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. "Because you saw us first. Because you acknowledged our existence. In your world, that has power. It creates connections." As it spoke, I became aware of a change in the fog around us. It was moving, swirling, forming patterns that were almost hypnotic, and within those patterns I could see glimpses of something else, another world, another reality, pressing against the boundaries of our own. "The crossing has begun," the creature continued. "Soon all the barriers will fall, and we will walk freely in your world. But first we need guides, translators, those who can help us navigate the complexities of human existence." "We won't help you," I said, though my voice sounded weak and uncertain even to my own ears. The creature's smile widened. "You already have. Every time you saw us, every time you acknowledged our presence, you weakened the barriers. Your fear, your fascination, your desperate need to understand, it all feeds the crossing. You have been our unwitting servants from the very beginning." The fog began to thicken around us, and I could feel reality itself starting to shift and bend. The familiar streets of my neighborhood were fading, replaced by something altogether more alien. The houses became twisted, impossible structures that defied geometry and reason. The trees grew taller, their branches reaching toward a sky that was no longer quite the right color. "Welcome to our world," the creature said, its voice now coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome to the space between spaces, the realm of the pale ones, the kingdom of the yellow eyes." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break free from this nightmare, but my feet seemed rooted to the ground, and the fog pressed against me from all sides, thick and suffocating. I could feel my grip on reality slipping, my sense of self beginning to dissolve into the white void. But then, through the fog, I heard something unexpected. The sound of a car engine, growing louder by the second. The creatures turned toward the sound, their eyes blazing with anger and confusion. The fog began to part, and I saw my friend's car barreling through the mist, its headlights cutting through the darkness like twin swords. "Get in," my friend shouted, and I didn't hesitate. I dove into the car as it screeched to a halt, and we sped away from the creatures, away from the fog, away from the twisted landscape that had replaced my neighborhood. But as we drove, I could see in the rearview mirror that the fog was following us, spreading across the town like a living thing. The creatures moved within it, their forms becoming more solid, more real with each passing moment. They were no longer content to lurk in the shadows or stand passively in the mist. They were hunting, actively pursuing us through the fog-shrouded streets. We reached the park just as the fog began to thin, and we could see the creatures gathered there in vast numbers. They filled the entire clearing, standing in perfect formation, their eyes blazing like a constellation of malevolent stars. But something was different about them now. They were no longer the passive observers we had first encountered. They stood like an army, ready for battle, ready to claim this world as their own. The large creature, their leader, I realized, stepped forward from the ranks. When it spoke, its voice carried clearly through the fog, addressing not just us but the entire world. "The crossing is complete," it announced. "The barriers have fallen, and we are free to walk among you. Your world is now our world, and we will no longer hide in the shadows." As if to demonstrate its point, the fog began to lift, revealing the creatures in all their terrible glory. They stood in the pale moonlight, no longer translucent or spectral but solid and real. Their eyes burned with triumph, and their mouths curved in smiles that promised nothing but horror. But as the fog cleared, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. The park was no longer the familiar place we had known. The trees were wrong, twisted into impossible shapes. The river ran black under the moonlight, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with malevolent energy. This was no longer our world. It was theirs, and we were the intruders now. The creatures began to move, flowing out of the park and into the town beyond. They moved with purpose, with direction, no longer content to simply watch and wait. They were claiming their territory, marking it as their own, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. We sat in the car, paralyzed by the magnitude of what we had witnessed. The world as we knew it was ending, replaced by something alien and terrible. The creatures we had first seen swaying in the fog were now the masters of this new reality, and we were nothing more than witnesses to the apocalypse. But as I watched them spread across the landscape, I realized that our role in this nightmare was far from over. We were the ones who had seen them first, who had acknowledged their existence, who had inadvertently helped them cross over into our world. We were their unwitting servants, their guides into the realm of the living. And now, as the fog finally lifted and the creatures claimed their new domain, I understood that we would never be free of them. We were bound to them by something deeper than fear, something more primal than terror. We were part of their world now, just as they were part of ours. The crossing was complete, and there was no going back. The pale ones with their blazing yellow eyes had won, and the world would never be the same again. In the distance I could hear the sounds of chaos beginning. Car alarms, screaming, the crackle of emergency radios. The rest of the world was just beginning to realize what had happened, but we had known for months. We had seen the signs, witnessed the preparations, watched as the barriers between worlds grew thin and finally shattered. And now, as the creatures spread across the landscape like a plague of pale shadows, I knew that our long nightmare was just beginning. The Watchers had become the Watched, and we were all prisoners in a world that no longer belonged to us. The fog was gone, but the creatures remained, and they would never leave. They had found their new home, and we were going to have to learn to live with them, if we were lucky enough to survive that long. The rain hammered down on the roof of my rusty pickup truck as I navigated the winding mountain roads of the Appalachian wilderness. The rhythmic slapping of the wipers and the drum of raindrops on metal were the only sounds besides the low growl of the engine. I was utterly alone out here, miles from civilization, just the way I wanted it. My name is Ethan Begay. I'm a 28-year-old Arizona native, half Navajo on my mother's side. I had been living in Atlanta for the past few years, working a dead-end office job that slowly crushed my soul day by day. My life had begun to feel like one giant hamster wheel of pointless emails, endless meetings, and fake smiles, not to mention my disastrous love life and growing credit card debts. I was deeply unhappy and knew I needed a change, so I walked away from it all, quit my job, sold my meager possessions, and loaded up my truck to embark on a long solo hiking trip along the famed Appalachian Trail. I craved the simplicity, the isolation, the feeling of being a tiny speck swallowed up by the vastness of nature. Out here, my cubicle and commute and relationship drama all seemed trivial. It was a chance to escape, to reset, to grapple with the big questions of life while testing myself against the elements. I planned to hike for several months, living out of my truck and tent, until I figured out what to do next with my rudderless life. But now, shrouded in darkness and rain on an empty forest road, second thoughts began to creep in. Was I really prepared for this? I considered myself outdoorsy, but most of my experience was limited to shorter weekend camping trips, not a multi-month solo through hike. Did I have the right gear, enough food, sufficient backcountry skills? My stomach churned with anxiety as I navigated ever deeper into the mountains. I thought back to the stories I'd read online from former through hikers and national park rangers, tales of close calls with lightning strikes, almost getting lost in blizzards, encounters with aggressive bears, and of course the occasional whispered mention of seeing and hearing strange things in the woods that defied explanation, things that sounded suspiciously like Bigfoot. I had always rolled my eyes at that stuff, chalking it up to overactive imaginations and campfire tales. But now, alone in the thick Appalachian forest in the dead of night, those stories didn't seem quite so far-fetched. Every flash of lightning illuminated twisted branches that looked like grasping claws. Every gust of wind sounded like the heavy breathing of some hulking creature hidden in the darkness. Get it together, Ethan, I chided myself. It's just your mind playing tricks. Suddenly, my headlights caught a flash of movement ahead. I slammed on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat. In the beams, I glimpsed a huge shaggy silhouette loping across the road on two legs before it vanished into the forest. It had only been a split second, but it was far too large to be a bear, and something about the way it moved seemed strangely human. A trickle of icy sweat ran down my back. No, it couldn't be. I took a deep breath, trying to slow my racing pulse. It had to have been a trick of the light and rain, a shadow playing on overhanging branches. Bigfoot wasn't real. I was just spooking myself, like a kid telling ghost stories and then leaping at every nighttime creak of the house. I just needed to get to the trailhead, set up my tent and get some sleep. Things would feel less ominous in the light of day. I drove on, more timidly now, straining to see through the rain-streaked windshield into the forest. But I couldn't shake the deep unease that had settled over me. That unsettling silhouette lingered in my mind. The way it had moved, so fluidly, yet with such bulk and power. As much as I tried to rationalize it away, some ancient instinct deep in my brainstem sensed a predator in the darkness and set my nerves jangling with primal fear. Little did I know, things were about to get so much worse. That fleeting roadside glimpse would pale in comparison to the heart-stopping horrors and sanity-bending revelations awaiting me in the woods. I was about to plunge headlong into a nightmare of blood, legends, and a mysterious creature that would force me to question everything I thought I knew about the world. Watery gray light seeped through the nylon walls of my tent, dragging me out of a restless sleep tangled in my damp sleeping bag. I sat up, blinking and disoriented, trying to shake off the eerie sense of dread that clung to me like morning mist. The rain had stopped, replaced by an unnatural stillness, broken only by the occasional plaintive bird call. Rubbing the grit from my eyes, I tried to convince myself that the events of last night had been a dream, that I hadn't really seen a hulking, sloping figure dash across the road, just a manifestation of my anxiety about this trip. Unzipping the tent flap, I crawled out to greet the day. My small camp was just as I'd left it, tent pitched by the ashes of a fire ring. Bare canister of food hoisted into a tree. My pack and hiking boots sheltered under a rainfly, and all around the dense Appalachian forest stretched away in every direction, wisps of mist twining between the pines and leafless hardwoods. I went through the familiar motions of boiling water on my camp stove for instant coffee and oatmeal. But even these small rituals of backcountry life couldn't dispel my unease. The woods felt wrong somehow, too still and watchful, like unseen eyes were observing my every move. I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Sternly, I tried to shake myself out of it. I was an experienced hiker letting my imagination run wild. Time to pack up camp, shoulder my backpack and put some trail miles behind me. Maybe the meditative rhythm of my boots on dirt would help clear the cobwebs of paranoia from my mind. Within the hour I was hiking, my 50-pound pack a familiar burden as I switchbacked up a ridgeline. It was strangely quiet. I should have heard the chatter of squirrels, the drum of woodpeckers, the skittering of chipmunks in the leaf litter. But the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Even the wind made no sound as it combed the firs. Then I smelled it. A musky, rank odor on the breeze, like wet dog mixed with rotting leaves and something even fouler. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I knew that smell from my time in the Southwest. It was the smell of a predator, a mountain lion, a bear, a wolf, some creature at the top of the food chain. Adrenaline jolted through my system as I paused, trying to see through the trees and evaluating my options if I encountered something. That was when I noticed the silence. The few birds and animals I'd heard earlier had gone utterly quiet. An oppressive stillness hung over the forest like a shroud. The odor grew stronger, and with it a spine-chilling certainty crystallized within me. I was being watched, stalked, hunted, slowly fighting every instinct to freeze. I slid my pack off and reached for the bear spray holstered on the hip belt. My fingers trembled as I wrapped them around the canister. Some part of me knew this wasn't a bear I was dealing with. It was something far more terrifying, more unknown. A guttural sound shattered the silence, rising from the shadows of a grove of hemlocks. It was a growl, but deeper and more powerful than anything I'd ever heard, edged with a nearly human quality. That same ancient voice of instinct from the night before now screamed at me, "Run." I abandoned my pack and crashed into the forest, bear spray clutched in one white-knuckled hand as branches whipped at my face. Behind me, heavy footfalls gave chase, snapping saplings and crunching through deadfall at a terrifying speed. The growl rose again, so loud it vibrated in my bones, spurring me to even greater speeds of panicked flight. My lungs and legs burned as I sprinted blindly, hurtling over mossy boulders and fallen logs. How could something so huge move so quickly through the dense woods? No natural animal could pursue like this. The horrifying reality I'd denied all night now clamped onto my brain with iron certainty. My roadside sighting had been no trick of the light. I was being chased by a creature that shouldn't exist outside of folklore and tabloid headlines. Bigfoot was real. It was here in the Appalachian wilderness, and it was hunting me. I fled through the forest in a gasping panic, expecting at any moment to feel the slam of a gigantic hand on my back, the slash of claws, the crush of jaws. But the crashing footfalls and guttural roars gradually faded behind me as I put more distance between myself and my pursuer. Despite its shocking speed, it seemed the creature couldn't match my sheer, desperately terrified pace. After an eternity that couldn't have been more than a quarter mile, I had to stop, bending double with hands braced on knees as I heaved for air. The growls and footsteps had ceased. I was alone again in the stillness of the forest, surrounded by birdsong and breeze as if nothing had happened. But the burn of lactic acid in my muscles and the rank odor still hanging in the air told me it had been all too real. 1,000 questions whirled through my reeling brain. What was that thing? Was it really Bigfoot, or had I encountered some freakish mutant bear? Why was it chasing me? And most pressing, where was it now? There was no way I was hiking back the way I'd come to retrieve my abandoned backpack. It held my tent, sleeping bag, most of my food, my phone, everything I needed to survive out here and get help. But returning to that grove of hemlocks was out of the question with that thing lurking somewhere in the shadows. I had to keep moving. Had to get to the nearest ranger station or road and tell someone what I'd seen. They'd probably think I was crazy or hallucinating, but I had to try. I couldn't just wander the backcountry waiting to become Sasquatch's next meal. Taking deep breaths to steady my nerves, I got my bearings and started hiking again, bear spray still clutched in one clammy hand. I was intensely aware of how alone and vulnerable I was now without my pack and supplies. I had a jacket, a knife, some matches, a compass, and a few power bars in my pockets, but that was it. No shelter, no sleeping bag, very little food. I shivered at the thought of being caught out here at night. As I walked, seeing the forest through newly terrified eyes, I noticed more unsettling details. There were odd broken branches high up in the trees, far higher than any bear could reach. Tufts of coarse brown fur snagged on twigs. Indistinct impressions in the mud that could almost be footprints, if feet came in size 25. How long had this creature been here? Was I the first to encounter it? The shadows began to lengthen as afternoon ticked towards evening. My mind raced as I tried to calculate how many miles I'd covered, how close I might be to a road or help. But in my panicked flight, I'd gotten disoriented and wasn't entirely sure I was going the right direction. The weight of my aloneness in the vast wilds settled over me like a smothering blanket. Then I rounded a bend in the trail and stumbled to a halt, my stomach turning to ice. About 50 feet ahead of me, the path was blocked by a massive twisted tree trunk, and hunched on top of it, staring right at me with disturbingly intelligent eyes and a heavily browed face, was an 8-foot-tall wall of fur and muscle. The creature slowly rose to its full imposing height, lips curling back to reveal yellowed fangs. My legs turned to jelly. It had circled around and cut me off, hurting me like prey. The message was clear. There would be no escape. With a roar that shook the forest, Bigfoot started toward me, and I knew I was going to die. I stood frozen as the creature loped toward me, its huge frame eating up the distance with terrible speed. My brain screamed at my legs to run, but they wouldn't obey, paralyzed by the sheer overwhelming terror of seeing a childhood monster brought to nightmarish life. Some distant part of my mind clinically observed details, the shaggy fur, the barrel chest, the incongruously human-like eyes, but mostly my entire being was consumed by the knowledge that I was about to be ripped limb from limb by an apex predator. 20 feet away now, its rotten stench filling my nostrils. 15 feet. 10. Still I couldn't move, couldn't blink, as if immobilized by the hypnotic stare of those uncannily aware eyes boring into mine. A detached calm settled over me as I realized these were my last moments alive. At least the mystery of Bigfoot would be solved when they found my mangled remains, I thought with a tinge of hysteria. The creature pulled up short an arm's length from me, so close I could see the individual silver hairs on its chin, the chips in its curved claws, the scarred skin visible beneath its pelt. It towered over me, its bulk blocking out the forest behind it. There was nowhere to run. I braced myself for the bone-crushing grip, the rending teeth. But they didn't come. The massive creature stared down at me, breathing hard, but made no move to attack. Its expression almost seemed curious, wary. I barely dared to breathe, not wanting to break the spell. Slowly, moving like I was in a dream, I raised my open palms in what I prayed was a universal gesture of, I mean no harm. I had no idea if it would understand, but I had to try something. I'm not a threat, I said softly, my voice shaking. I don't want to hurt you. I'm just lost, please. The Bigfoot cocked its head, eerily bird-like. Could it understand me? There was an undeniable glimmer of intelligence, even comprehension, in its eyes as it studied my face. For a long moment we stood motionless, regarding each other, an impossible detente. Then slowly, deliberately, it took a step back, then another, not turning its back on me. I remained frozen, afraid to make any sudden moves. Was it going to let me go? My hammering heart dared to hope. But as it backed away, never taking its eyes off me, its foot came down on a dead branch with a resounding crack. The sound shattered the charged silence and seemed to break the trance that had fallen over the creature. Its eyes went wide and wild, its lips peeling back in a snarl. A guttural roar erupted from its chest, and it coiled to spring, to attack. Time seemed to slow. Without conscious thought, I raised the bear spray canister that I somehow still held in my white-knuckled grip. I pressed the trigger, sending a high-pressure stream of capsaicin mist directly into its face as it lunged for me. The creature bellowed in pain as the spray blinded it, clutching at its eyes and staggering. I wasted no time, whirling to dash down the trail with speed I didn't know I possessed. Enraged roars and the crashing of pursuit followed me once more, but I seemed to have bought myself a small lead this time. I hurdled fallen logs and tore through underbrush, trying desperately to keep ahead of the sounds of my pursuer thrashing in pain somewhere behind me. My only thought was to get as much distance as possible while it was incapacitated, chest heaving and legs burning. I finally burst out of the tree line, and almost wept in relief at the sight of asphalt under my boots. A desolate road, free of tire tracks or power lines, but a road nonetheless. I raced down the blacktop, straining to hear if the creature would follow, but the forest behind me remained silent save for the trilling of evening tree frogs. I must have run a quarter mile before I allowed myself to collapse, cramping thighs no longer able to hold me upright. Gasping, I looked around wildly, realizing I had no idea where I was or how far I'd fled. But I was alive. Against all odds I'd escaped the creature, and I knew two things with absolute certainty as I gulped lungfuls of air by that empty backwoods road. Bigfoot was real, and it didn't want humans encroaching on its forest. I had to get to the authorities, had to warn people somehow. As I hauled myself to my feet, I noticed something that sent ice water trickling through my veins. On the shoulder of the road, sunk deep into the soft dirt, was an enormous humanoid footprint. The creature had followed the road here at some point. Did that mean it ventured out of the deep woods sometimes, to look for prey? The thought chilled me to my core. I had to get out of these mountains. I had no gear, no food, no way to defend myself if it came back. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping against hope it would lead me to a ranger station, a parking lot, another hiker, any sign of humanity. The sun dipped below the ridgeline, shadows overtaking the forest. It would be full dark soon. My mind reeled, struggling to process the enormity of what I had seen, what I now knew. All the Bigfoot stories, the blurry photos and shaky videos, the claims dismissed by skeptics as hoaxes and myth, they were true. All of them. A huge furred hominid creature really did roam the Appalachian wilderness. An undiscovered primate, a missing link, monster, and I was likely the only person alive who had seen it up close and could prove its existence. I had to get my evidence and my story out there. But first I had to survive the hike out. Had to survive the night with that creature still out there, angry and hunting. The same thoughts chased themselves around and around my exhausted brain as I stumbled down the darkening road. Find help. Warn people. Get out alive. Only the raw instinct to survive kept my battered legs moving through the pain and fatigue. The night would be long and cold and full of terrors. But one way or another, I vowed, I would live to tell this tale, to reveal to the world the truth I had uncovered in these ancient mysterious mountains. The truth about the long-denied, much-feared creature that haunted the vast forests of the continent's oldest range. The truth I had experienced up close in all its frightening, awe-inspiring reality. Bigfoot was real, and now I had to make everyone believe. Night fell swiftly, draping the mountains in deep blue shadows that pooled into inky blackness between the trees. The temperature dropped just as quickly, the last of the day's warmth seeming to evaporate with the fading light. I shivered in my thin jacket, wishing desperately for the warm layers I'd abandoned in my pack. I walked doggedly down the empty road, gravel crunching rhythmically under my boots, breath puffing in the chilly air. All around, the darkened forest loomed, suddenly sinister, full of imagined movement and threat in the corner of my eye. Every rustle of branches, every hoot of an owl, every skitter of unseen claws in the underbrush made me flinch and whirl, expecting a tall, furry silhouette to come bursting out of the black tangle of trunks. But I seemed truly alone now on this barren stretch of road. The creature left far behind in the back country. Small comfort, given I still had no idea how many miles lay between me and the nearest outpost of civilization, or what other dangers I might encounter in the long, cold night ahead. The nearly full moon rose as I walked, casting weak light and long shadows through the skeletal branches. The silvery illumination only served to make the forest more eerie, more alien and hostile. I felt keenly my aloneness, my fragility out here in the vast, uncaring wild. A solitary little figure, trudging defiantly through a landscape that could swallow me without a trace. Time took on a surreal quality as I hiked, exhaustion and adrenaline, and residual shock warping each minute into a small eternity. The night was a void, featureless and unending. Tree trunks strobed by in the moonlight. Gravel crunched, breath puffed. No way to mark progress, just the black road unspooling forever into the greater blackness of the mountains. At some point it occurred to me that I didn't actually know if I was heading toward help and humanity, or just deeper into trackless wilderness. My mental map of the area was hazy at best, and my earlier panicked flight had completely disoriented me. For all I knew, I could be walking away from the nearest ranger station or road, away from any chance of rescue. But I had no choice but to keep putting one foot in front of the other, to simply endure, to hope that each step brought me closer to light, and people, and an end to this nightmare hike. The cold seeped into my bones, stiffening my joints and numbing my face and fingers. A relentless wind hissed in the trees and knifed straight through my inadequate jacket. I began to shiver uncontrollably, my muscles burning with the constant tremors. A deep grinding fatigue bore down on me, the adrenaline that had sustained my flight finally wearing off. When I stumbled over a pothole and nearly pitched face first onto the asphalt, I realized I couldn't keep this up all night. Sooner or later I would collapse from cold and exhaustion. I had to get off my feet for a while, had to rest and try to warm up, just for an hour or two. It was a risk, especially unarmed and exposed, but I was no good to myself dead of hypothermia by morning. Grudgingly, hating every step that took me off the road and into the tree line, I made my way into the forest until I found a small clearing. Gathering an armload of dry leaves and pine needles, I piled them into the hollow of a fallen log, praying the meager insulation would help trap some of my body heat. I hunkered down into my makeshift nest, tucking my knees to my chest and burying my hands in my armpits to warm my numb fingers. I was still shivering violently, my teeth chattering so hard my jaw ached, but curling up tight conserved at least a little more heat. I pulled dead leaves and pine boughs over myself like a blanket as an extra shield against the cutting wind. Warmer now, but by no means warm. I tried to relax into the least uncomfortable position possible within the log. Every muscle ached fiercely. Every joint protested. The log felt like the hardest bed I'd ever slept on, and my stomach growled angrily at its emptiness. But despite the cold, pain, and hunger, exhaustion inexorably pulled me towards unconsciousness. I fought it for a bit, trying to keep my senses sharp to any danger, any sound of approaching threat, but my fatigue was a rising tide, and I could only resist for so long. As my eyelids grew heavier and heavier, I found myself thinking of the Bigfoot. Where was it now? Was it hunting me still, following my trail with some uncanny primate sense of smell? Or had it retreated deep into the untouched wilderness, to lick its wounds and nurse its fury at my escape? Part of me wanted nothing more than to put the creature far out of my mind, to forget those terrifyingly human eyes and the shocking speed and power of its pursuit. But another part was darkly fascinated, reeling at the world-shaking revelation I now carried. A new species, uncatalogued by science, roaming the same continent as millions of humans and yet unproven for centuries. How was that possible? What exactly was it? How many were there? Sleep finally overtook me, dragging me down into a restless doze haunted by shaggy silhouettes that raced between dark trees and snatched at me with clawed hands. I startled awake over and over, heart slamming against my ribs, sure I'd heard the snap of twigs and glimpsed a huge shape moving in the shadows. But the forest remained still around me, watchful and secretive. I had uncovered a piece of its secret today, a truth that was never supposed to see the light. I had looked into the intelligent, ancient eyes of an impossibility made flesh, and I couldn't escape the feeling that, one way or another, there would be a price to pay for that forbidden knowledge. The night still held many hours of darkness, many miles of wilderness to traverse, and I knew deep in my shivering bones that my encounter, my survival, had been no fluke of chance. There was some grim purpose at work here, some larger design that had spared my life when by all odds I should have died today under the creature's claws. I had looked into the face of legend, and I was sure my ordeal was far from over. I woke with a startled jerk, momentarily confused by the pale gray light filtering down through the skeletal branches. For a second I didn't know where I was. Then the events of the previous day came crashing back and I groaned. Every muscle screamed in protest as I unfolded myself stiffly from the hollow of the log, pine needles and leaf detritus raining off me. It was cold, but not as bitingly frigid as last night. The eastern sky held the colorless glow of pre-dawn tree trunks and boulders slowly resolving out of the gloom. A heavy mist crept between the dark verticals of the trees, swirling eerily in the breathless calm. I allowed myself a moment of raw relief and gratitude that I had survived the night. Despite my exhaustion, I had been sure I would snap awake with a scream at any moment to find myself in the grip of a huge hairy hand, or worse, that I simply wouldn't wake up at all, dragged off in the dark to a grisly fate while I slept. But dawn had come, and I was still here, chilled to the bone, battered and hollow with hunger, but alive, and I intended to stay that way. I ignored the protests of my aching body as best I could, and staggered back to the road, resuming my dogged march in the same direction as last night. My breath plumed white in the misty air, and my stomach cramped with hunger. But I made myself keep moving. I had to be close to a road or a trail junction or something by now, I told myself. Just a few more miles and I'd find a landmark, a hiker, a ranger truck, a miraculous cell signal. A few more miles and this nightmare would finally be over. The dawn slowly lightened the sky to silver, then pearl, then pale gold as I trudged onward down the empty road. Songbirds began to twitter from the trees, and somewhere high overhead a hawk screeched as it rode a thermal in lazy circles. Now and then I heard small rustlings in the dry leaves as rodents and other animals went about their morning routines. The forest was waking up, and I knew all too well now what else might be waking with it. My stomach turned queasily at the thought of the creature out there, either still hunting me or retreated to some unknown lair to nurse its rage. I shuddered to think what it might do if it picked up my trail again. The bear spray trick unlikely to work a second time. I had to stay alert, stay aware of my surroundings. So despite my desperate desire to simply put my head down and hike until I dropped, I made myself scan the trees and mud at the road's shoulder for tracks, scat, any sign that the Bigfoot might have followed my path in the night. But I saw nothing save deer prints, raccoon tracks, the occasional unsettlingly large canine paw print that I told myself belonged to a coyote or feral dog. The golden sun finally hauled itself over the ridgeline, dappling the road with pure warm light that eased a little of the night's deep chill from my bones. But even the sun's rays couldn't entirely banish the eerie sense of being watched, of something out there in the seemingly innocent wilderness malevolently marking my progress. How far did the creature's territory extend? Miles? I had no way to know, and the uncertainty lent a palpable tension to every step. But as the sun climbed higher and my legs gobbled up more miles, the simple animal need of my body began to eclipse even the fear of the Bigfoot. Hiking burned a tremendous amount of calories, and I hadn't eaten since the handful of oatmeal I'd had for breakfast yesterday morning before my world turned upside down. I was actively dizzy with hunger now, each step requiring a monumental effort of will. I knew I couldn't go on much longer without food. I was probably badly dehydrated too, even the adrenaline of terror unable to completely override the demands of my cells for nourishment and water. If I didn't find people or a water source soon, that would kill me as surely as any cryptozoological monster. And then around yet another bend in the endless road, a miracle, actual tire tracks in the dirt shoulder, and the distant but unmistakable rumble of an engine. Nearly weeping with relief, I began to jog toward the sound, waving my arms and hollering. It had to be a ranger truck or a forestry vehicle, my salvation in Ford form. But as I rounded the curve, the sight that greeted me drove the breath from my lungs as if I'd been punched. There, about a quarter mile ahead where the road dead-ended into a small parking lot, was my truck. My truck with branches wedged under the tires and the hood up. And hunched over the open engine compartment, huge hairy back and sloping head unmistakable, was the creature. It looked up as I stumbled to a halt, my shocked gasp loud in the morning hush, and its eyes squinting against the morning light locked onto me with laser focus. Eyes that held an unsettlingly keen intelligence and a disturbingly familiar glint. Because in that moment I realized where I had seen those eyes before. In the mirror. Those eyes, set deep under heavy brows in that not quite human face, were my eyes. My great-grandfather, who my Navajo mother always said was different, but would never explain how. My great-grandfather, who disappeared one day in the mountains and was never seen again. My great-grandfather, whose high cheekbones and broad nose and inky hair I saw reflected now in the face of the creature 60 feet away. I stood paralyzed, the world tilting dizzyingly on its axis, as the Bigfoot, my ancestor, began to stride toward me. There was horribly familiar purpose in its gaze, something like grim resignation, and an awful heavy knowledge. And I knew I hadn't survived our encounter by chance after all. I hadn't gotten away, not really, because it had let me go. It had let me go, and then expertly herded me here, to this place, cutting me off from the roads, wearing me down, forcing me to use up my bear spray, pushing me in the direction it wanted me to go all along. I hadn't been fleeing. I had been led here, to my truck, to this dead end. To what end I was about to find out, as the creature closed the distance between us with ground-eating strides. I remained rooted to the spot, no longer having the strength or will to run. It was clear now that there was nowhere to run to. Because this, I realized, was what the creature had been patiently, inexorably maneuvering me towards all along. This reunion, this dark reckoning, this moment when I would come face to face with the inexplicable truth of my family history, the last secret of my ancestors, manifested in undeniable flesh and blood, a legacy of wildness, of primal mystery, lurking in my very genes. Genes that had drawn me inexorably to the vast ancient forests of these mountains for reasons I could never quite articulate. Until now, I finally knew why I had really come out here, why some deep-buried part of me was unsurprised to encounter the Bigfoot, why some shameful splinter of my soul had recognized those two human eyes, even as my civilized brain screamed in denial. Because on some level, I had known it was here all along, known it was real, and that it was a part of me as surely as my heartbeat, known in the most secret chambers of my heart, that one day I would have to face it. And now, as it loomed over me, its rancid breath heavy in my nostrils, I knew something else too, knew it in my chilled and weary bones, an ancestral certainty as old as these mountains. I was never meant to leave this forest. There would be no harrowing escape, no eventual return to the ranger station with proof and a world-shaking tale. There couldn't be, because I was the proof, I was the tale. Here is the completed story. The creature gazed down at me, and I gazed back, numb now to the fear and revulsion, to everything but a grim sense of inevitability, of a circle finally closing, a cycle as primal and powerful as the turning of the seasons. It reached out one huge humanoid hand. I didn't flinch, didn't try to pull away. There was no point. I understood now, with a dreadful sinking finality. This was why it had spared me, why it had let me go, only to lead me here. Not to kill me, but to claim me, to bring me into the fold at last, this prodigal descendant, to make me one with the wildness that had birthed legends and haunted humanity's dreams since our species first huddled in caves. I was the proof of Bigfoot, but I was also kin to Bigfoot, and there was a place for me, it seemed, in their shadowed world between myth and reality, a place I could no longer deny or run from. The huge hand closed around my wrist, the grip terribly strong but not painful. And with no more than that light touch, the creature turned and began walking into the trees, drawing me inexorably behind it, back into the deep forest and the primal dark. I did not resist. I couldn't. This, I knew now, was why I had come to these mountains in the first place, though I hadn't known it at the time. That ancient yearning, that nebulous dissatisfaction that had plagued me all my life, driving me from city to city, job to job, relationship to relationship, it had been leading me here, to this moment, this dark epiphany in the chill morning light. I belonged to the wilderness, to the ancient mystery of my ancestors. I always had. And now the wilderness, in the form of this huge, shaggy creature, had come to take me home. I spared one last glance back at my truck, at the road I had stumbled down, at the world I was leaving behind. The world that would never know what had become of me, where I had gone or why. The world that would never believe the truth of what I had seen, what I was. And then I turned and let the creature lead me away, vanishing between the dark verticals of the trees like a ghost, like a myth made flesh, a legend going to ground once more. I left no tracks, no traces, and I knew as the forest closed around me with a cool green finality that it would keep my secret, would hold me close in its primeval embrace, one more mystery in a wilderness ancient and unknowable. I was going home. At long last, I was going home. The creature gazed down at me, and I gazed back, numb now to the fear and revulsion, to everything but a grim sense of inevitability, of a circle finally closing, a cycle as primal and powerful as the turning of the seasons. It reached out one huge humanoid hand. I didn't flinch, didn't try to pull away. There was no point. I understood now, with a dreadful sinking finality. This was why it had spared me, why it had let me go, only to lead me here, not to kill me, but to claim me, to bring me into the fold at last, this prodigal descendant, to make me one with the wildness that had birthed legends and haunted humanity's dreams since our species first huddled in caves. I was the proof of Bigfoot, but I was also kin to Bigfoot, and there was a place for me, it seemed, in their shadowed world between myth and reality, a place I could no longer deny or run from. The huge hand closed around my wrist, the grip terribly strong but not painful, and with no more than that light touch, the creature turned and began walking into the trees, drawing me inexorably behind it, back into the deep forest and the primal dark. I did not resist. I couldn't. This, I knew now, was why I had come to these mountains in the first place, though I hadn't known it at the time. That ancient yearning, that nebulous dissatisfaction that had plagued me all my life, driving me from city to city, job to job, relationship to relationship, it had been leading me here, to this moment, this dark epiphany in the chill morning light. I belonged to the wilderness, to the ancient mystery of my ancestors. I always had. And now the wilderness, in the form of this huge shaggy creature, had come to take me home. I spared one last glance back at my truck, at the road I had stumbled down, at the world I was leaving behind, the world that would never know what had become of me, where I had gone or why, the world that would never believe the truth of what I had seen, what I was. And then I turned and let the creature lead me away, vanishing between the dark verticals of the trees like a ghost, like a myth made flesh, a legend going to ground once more. I left no tracks, no traces, and I knew as the forest closed around me with a cool green finality, that it would keep my secret, would hold me close in its primeval embrace. One more mystery in a wilderness, ancient and unknowable. I was going home. At long last, I was going home.